Let's bring in our guest now. David Shinn is an adjunct professor at the George Washington University and a former U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia and Burkina Faso. We're also joined by Zainab, Usman, senior fellow and program director of Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you both for joining us on what is this really remarkably hot day up here on this very high roof. Obviously, U.S. is losing influence in Africa. I want to put this question to you both, Ambassador, first. Is this because the U.S. isn't trying?
No, I think the U.S. is clearly trying, and I think the Biden administration has tried harder than some previous administrations. The problem is one of growing competition in Africa. Everyone talks about China getting engaged in Africa, and that's true. But it's not just China. It's India. It's the Arab states. It's Russia in certain sectors. It's even some countries like Indonesia that are showing growing interest in the continent. So you have all of this competition out there, and you have the African countries saying, look, we're going to take advantage of whatever countries we can take advantage of. And then, of course, you have the European Union's countries still engaged also. So relatively speaking, the U.S. is losing some leverage. It's losing some influence on the continent, but it's due to all of these other factors that come into play.
What do you think?
Yes, I would largely agree and reinforce the points made by the ambassador. For the longest time, Africa has not really figured prominently in U.S. foreign policy priorities, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is also geographical. You know, the U.S. being in North America, Africa being where it is, and Africa being actually closer to Europe. So that relationship with Europe has been quite strong, you know, regardless of how you think about the relationship. Another one would be historical. You know, there's that kind of colonial history with Europe that does not necessarily exist with the United States. But a third and very important reason is also economic. Africa, you know, is not a major trading partner of the United States. Actually, trade volumes between the U.S. and Africa account for less than 2% of U.S. total global commerce. But the current administration, the Biden administration, has made a lot of effort in coming up with the new Africa strategy, in having senior officials visit the continent, including Vice President Kamala Harris, and, you know, just trying to come up with even an infrastructure project, the Lobito Corridor project, for example. But there's just a lot more engagement with the continent by actors like China. China is now Africa's largest trading partner, is a major provider of development financing, is a major constructor of infrastructure projects. Russia, which is now an important security partner for some countries in the Sahel, in West Africa, and then the Arab states. So there's a lot more competition. And African countries are also becoming very, very assertive in terms of what their priorities are, nationally, regionally, but also globally.
Ambassador, I wanted to talk to you about the U.S. military and its role when it comes to these countries. Obviously, there's growing anger at the U.S. military, kicked out of Niger, kicked out of Chad, although just last month there were reports that U.S. Special Forces are back there. What's the history of this? Why is there so much distrust of the U.S. military?
Well, for most of this century, the United States military effort in Africa has been aimed at countering terrorism. And there was some good that was done in that respect, and some of it still continues in places like Somalia, for example, where U.S. Special Forces are still very much engaged in combating Al-Shabaab. But I think the heavy focus on counterterrorism, and in some cases unsuccessful efforts in countering terrorism, discouraged some of the African countries, particularly in the Sahel region, countries like Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, to turn to other possible sources of help. So they've turned to Russia now, with the Wagner Group initially, and now with the Africa Corps that Russia is setting up. But quite frankly, those organizations are also encountering setbacks. So I think they're going to learn pretty quickly that even though the United States may not have always found the answer, that Russia's not going to be the answer either. The U.S. is also very involved in training in Africa, and that goes on, and that, I think, is quite successful.
You're an economist. Let's talk about the China piece. $254 billion in 2021. from the U.S. perspective, they always come out, the Biden administration, say, well, China's just using them for resources and they're not in it for a long-term partnership. Is there any truth to that, or is that the U.S. just basically sour grapes because they're losing influence?
You know, China has emerged as an important economic partner for Africa within a specific context, and that context is that about 2-3 decades ago, when a lot of countries, African countries, were emerging out of military rule, civil wars. You think about Nigeria, Angola, Rwanda, Ethiopia, etc. They needed investments for infrastructure projects, and they had nowhere to turn to. The development, multilateral development banks, the World Bank, and a couple of others were not doing infrastructure projects. In fact, they had put out a white paper in which they made it very clear that their priorities in Africa and other low-income regions of the world was going to be poverty reduction and social projects, you know, health and education. They decided that that was what was important. And a lot of countries did not have anywhere to turn to get infrastructure financing, and they turned to China. China also, at the time, it worked for it because it had excess capital and industrial capacity to export. Right, so it was kind of a match made in marginalized heaven, so to speak. But now the US and other G7 countries have realized that they also need to get into the infrastructure business in Africa, in fact, in other parts of the world. So now we have the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which is meant to be an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Coming to your question directly, is China exploiting Africa more or less? I think one also has to listen to what the African stakeholders are saying, what the policymakers or other citizens, and the story is really mixed. Those infrastructure projects, you know, you go to a lot of African countries right now, a lot of their airports are built by China. A lot of roads are built by China. A lot of hospitals are built by China. Sometimes the roads get washed away because the African interlocutors did not do their jobs very well in negotiating good deals, but sometimes the roads and the infrastructure projects hold up. So I think the key issue is that African countries do need investments. According to the African Development Bank, the African continent needs something in the region of $400 to $500 billion every year until 2030 to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a need for more investments from China, from the US,
from everyone.
From everyone.
I think we have to get into Sudan because I sit in briefings at the Pentagon, at the State Department. I've listened to briefings here at the White House. Sudan's not talked about, and it's the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. I mean, do you think the Biden administration has done enough? They proposed peace talks, it didn't work. Are they doing enough when it comes to humanitarian aid? What is the U.S. doing? Where are they?
Well, you're right in that certainly there's been no solution found for ending the really horrible civil war that's ongoing in Sudan. The Biden administration has stepped in. They've named a special envoy who is active and trying to bring parties together. He's the one leading the peace process. President Biden has actually made statements, public statements on Sudan, but it has not come anywhere close to ending the conflict there. The whole world is really to be blamed for not being.
The whole world is not the biggest superpower in the planet.
Well, that's true, but at least the United States is trying up to a limit. The problem is it's being totally preoccupied by things like the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, the U.S.-China relationship, the U.S.-Russia relationship. And it's very hard for a country like even the United States to then take on something like Sudan. And as a result, it has not stepped up to the challenge yet. But I wouldn't say that it's for lack of trying. I think they have made efforts. These peace talks have simply not succeeded because the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudan Armed Forces aren't willing to compromise. They're not willing to sit down and meet. And if they're not willing to sit down and meet, then nothing is probably going to happen.
Zainab, last question to you. Do you see a change for U.S. policy in Africa, whether it's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump that wins the presidency? It's not talked about by anybody on the campaign trail.
No and yes. So the no part is that Africa policy for the longest time has basically not really changed by administration or by political party here, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans. In fact, Africa policy tends to be one of the areas where there's some kind of bipartisan consensus. That has been the case historically. although that consensus is starting to fracture in certain respects. So on that basis, I'm not sure there are key elements that are going to change. But on the other hand, there are also key differences that we could expect from a Kamala Harris presidency or Donald Trump presidency. In the case of Donald Trump, for example, we are likely to see less of an emphasis on, governance and human rights, and maybe an emphasis towards recognizing Somaliland, which could be in the Horn of Africa. In the case of Kamala Harris, I think we're going to see perhaps certain kinds of continuities of what has been going on in the Biden administration.
Well, thank you both so much for being here. I think it was a very informative discussion. Thanks again.